Finis Dogma, July 2060, on Earth. The consequences are beginning to be disastrous. In addition to CO2 and other greenhouse gases caused by human activity, the oceans have become more acidic, resulting in the loss of a huge quantity of marine life, which had the ability to absorb these gases. Many forests were also less and less able to absorb enough gases up to a point that they themselves were emitting CO2, while some others simply burned. Despite the means at their disposal, whether seaweed, electricity-generating windows, nuclear fission, electric cars, green energies, elastocaloric cooling, and so on, almost all these creations have been useless for one single reason. They are all dependent on the same world that created them, dependent on industries that favor fossil fuels, dependent on a finite world with limited resources. Humans didn't act fast enough nor hard enough. Overpopulation was a major issue for those who wanted a Western lifestyle. This problem had to be taken into account, but it was denied. One must never forget that in the 1930s, the population was around 2 billion. But due to the strong economic growth, thanks in part to the massive use of oil, abundance had begun around the 1950s. This is how the number of humans exploded. From around the year 400 to 1800, humans ranged from 200 million to around 1 billion. Then, 1850, approximately 1.2 billion. 1900, approximately 1.6 billion. 1930, 2 billion. 1960, 3 billion. 1975, 4 billion. 1990, 5.3 billion. 2000, 6.1 billion. 2010, 6.9 billion. 2023, 8 billion. 2030, 8.3 billion. The world's population is increasing, but the planet itself remains the same. The choice was either to reduce human activity at all costs, or to reduce the world's population. Despite growing awareness in the 1970s, and emerging scientific consensus in the 1980s, humans preferred to continue living in this dogma, which was already becoming a catalyst for what was to come. Societies had gradually made people individualistic, selfish, apathetic, and gradually detached from everything. In the first quarter of the 21st century, Western governments opted to make people work longer and harder under increasingly difficult conditions by introducing more and more the notion of competition and free trade, by pushing them to consume even more in a race for the cheapest objects created by companies that neglected the planet, to ensure that the powerful people lived in opulence. In the 2020s, things are accelerating as we can't force people to have babies, resulting in Western countries aging more and more. While the richest 1% own almost half of the world's wealth, while ordinary people didn't have the strength to change things radically, being too busy surviving, earning money, trying to get some pleasure out of life. Politicians kept people busy with non-issues, such as immigration, social fraud, transgender identity, and so on. At a time when developing countries around the world were aspiring to be like the developed countries mistakenly, at the time when temperatures are already starting to rise, slowly, how to reason, how to act, the cognitive dissonance is too big. The radical solution would have been to say goodbye to our 600 energy slaves, our machines, our factories, our cheap jeans, our cheap petrol, our cheap meat, and so on. But how can we do this when the world's governments favor the most polluting companies over the small, self-sufficient businesses when the world's governments favor intensive agriculture, mono-farming, when permaculture has proven its effectiveness time and time again, when the world's governments increasingly support the wealthiest and most powerful, and not their people as a whole, in order to all, together, modify mass consumption behaviors, travel, work, the definition of happiness. But that's like asking an addict to get sober overnight. The result will be the same. Mankind was addicted to fossil fuels, and a handful of them were addicted to money, which creates a loop. More money equals more fossil fuels. More fossil fuels equals more money. Living is already getting more and more complicated around the 2030s. Access to drinking water is complicated, whether for drinking or watering crops. The price of things starts to slowly but surely skyrocket. The population suffers. Big companies rejoice. The race for growth never ceased to be the focus. The world's population collapsed around 2070. Agricultural practices have never changed, wearing out the soils, making them nearly infertile, drastically reducing crop yields, and destroying biodiversity. Insects, birds, amphibians, mammals, many of which are in decline or even extinct due to inability or lack of time to adapt. Both nature and human societies are in a dire strait. Some areas are becoming less and less tolerable for life, including human life, as they are unsuited to this kind of climate. Regions of South America, Africa, and South Asia are beginning to be emptied of life as we know it, becoming far too hot, reaching 50 degrees Celsius, and far too humid, suffocating living beings. This phenomenon is known as wet temperatures. A radical change is underway. France's landscape has not been spared. It has become much more arid. Many people living in the south have not been able to adapt, and the heat waves are beginning to take their toll, so they've opted to move further north. Change is too fast to allow societies to adapt, in particular because of oil, which has become inaccessible to ordinary people for almost 30 years, which has made the transport of goods or people extremely difficult. Railroads are no longer repairable, as they were neglected for decades in the past, to the detriment of their great usefulness. Airplanes too have been grounded for a long time, except for once again a privileged few who has been able to hoard a certain amount of fuel. Fossil fuel producers, of course, favor their own countries. Crises come one after the other. The melting of the world's great glaciers, including Antarctica, is well underway and irreversible, accelerating global warming and altering underwater currents in the world's oceans. The ice reflected parts of the sun's ray like a mirror. As a result of the melting ice, water level is rising faster and faster, gradually wiping out archipelagos and altering coastline of many countries over the decades. Permafrost is not spared, but it releases viruses and bacteria against which our animal and plant species are no longer equipped to defend themselves. Around 2100 and before, the majority of people in countries stretching from the Tropic of Capricorn to the Tropic of Cancer and beyond migrated towards the poles. Billions of people lost their lives during these migratory movements due to the lack of water, food, shelter, or care. The utopia of a world population of almost 10 billion human beings will never be more than that. A utopia. The Earth would have never been able to support such a number of humans, not in the modern comfort to which everyone aspired, in the world created thanks to oil, this black gold, the source of so much progress and so much misery. By this time, the notion of border no longer existed, and those who had survived began, with difficulty to adapt to the destination they were able to reach, sometimes coming across natives who were able to acclimatize more easily thanks to their favorable geographical position. Rivalry still exists, but above all, racism, mistrust, ignorance, and intolerance. Many can't understand why global warming continues, despite the fact that mankind has not been polluting at a frantic pace for several decades. Few know that there is a 30-year lag between the moment of greenhouse gases emissions and the effect they cause. But the changes have been so radical that it will take hundreds of years to regain equilibrium, and the Earth will probably never be the same again. The human modern way of life has been reduced to nothingness. The dogma of money is no more. Throughout these difficult times, the only thing that matters to people, to simple people, is the survival of their child, their mother, their father, their sister, their brother, their grandfather, their grandmother, their lover, their cousin, their aunt, their uncle, their friend, their pet, all of them, singular or plural, masculine, feminine, agender, whatever, the love and survival of loved ones, and sometimes complete strangers. Nothing else mattered. A human being can't survive on his own, and despite selfish individualistic societies, will bonds be forged again between strangers, cultures, foreigners. Despite the communication difficulties caused by technologies that had disconnected people from real social relationship or interactions, human beings can adapt psychologically quite quickly, listening, discussing, understanding, being patient, and trusting. All these notions, sometimes lost, will have to be relearned. Human instinct remains cooperation, sharing, socializing, for survival. Everyone can learn something from each other, and sharing cultures and knowledge is a major asset to survival. And despite deep-seated guilt and hatred against the powerful who have run politics and industries, those who have destroyed the lives of billions of people over the decades, it was time to mourn a world of abundance, the end of dogma. Is humankind really capable of such an adaptation, of giving itself a real chance?